Constantine here, and this episode is a little different because I'm not actually going to be reviewing a specific movie. I'll be uploading another one right after this that does. But this is what I would like to call Constantine's Japanese Horror Bootcamp. All of the stuff I think you should know about Japanese horror and Japanese ghost stories if you're going to understand any J-horror, or whatever it's called, that you might watch. Contrary to popular belief, Japanese horror and the whole Japanese horror genre did not spring fully formed from the head of Nakata Hideo like Athena from the head of Zeus. Yeah, that's right. I make Greek mythology references. The Japanese film industry actually has a really long history of horror movies that goes all the way back to the golden age of Japanese cinema, which is right around the 1950s and the 1960s. Even then, many of the most successful Japanese horror movies were actually adaptations of old kabuki or no plays. But I think that if you really want to understand modern Japanese horror, then you need to look at the Meiji period, which is the 1860s up into the early 20th century. The country's rapid modernization that followed the overthrow of the Tokugawa shogunate really fundamentally transformed Japanese society, and it altered the way the Japanese people not only interacted with the state, but also how they interacted with one another. Even the realm of superstition was changed. In many ways, the new Meiji state tried to do away with folklore and superstitions of the past because they thought it was a threat to Japan's modernization. At the same time, the Meiji leaders also embraced and propagated perhaps the most influential myth and superstition in all of Japanese history, the one about the divine origin of the emperor and the sacred kokutai of the Japanese nation. If you're more interested in reading how Japanese society transformed its relationship with folklore and superstition during the Meiji period, then I highly recommend you read Gerald Figal's book, Civilization and Monsters, Spirits of Modernity in Meiji Japan. This is a scholarly book, so it can be quite dense, and some of the chapters do drag on a bit. However, at the same time, I consider it a must-read for anyone who's interested in Japanese folklore, Kaidan ghost stories, or even the Meiji period in general. It's really quite good. Moving away from all the boring academic mumbo-jumbo, if we're going to talk about the Meiji period, then I really feel obligated to mention two of the most influential Japanese novelists when it comes to the horror, mystery, suspense genre, Izumi Kyoka and Edogawa Rampo. Izumi Kyoka was a master of short stories, but he never really gained the respect of his contemporaries because he chose to use old-fashioned literary styles, similar to those used by kabuki plays or kaidan ghost stories. And he didn't use the style that was popular at the time, the so-called shi-shosetsu, or I-novel. I'm sure you've all heard of Natsume Soseki. He wrote Kokoro and I Am a Cat. Well, that sort of style of novel is called the I-novel. It's really grounded in reality and really only interested in depicting the boring details of day-to-day life. In contrast, Izumi Kyoka was really influenced by the mystery and superstition of Japanese folklore and Japanese ghost tales, and even though he never received a lot of critical attention while he was alive, it was Izumi Kyoka who first brought the traditional Japanese ghost into the modern city. It's in Kyoka's stories that we first see ghosts haunting the modern streets and lamplight of Tokyo, and they're no longer stuck in the dusty rafters of old Japanese farmhouses. So even though he struggled while he was alive, he really has had a very profound influence on Japanese novelists after his time and in the Japanese mystery horror genre in general. Even more well-known than Izumi Kyoka, however, is Edogawa Rampo, the man responsible for bringing the Western detective mystery novel or short story to Japan. He's known as the Japanese Edgar Allan Poe, and his name, in fact, is a Japanese phonetic pronunciation of Edgar Allan Poe. Edogawa Rampo. Edgar Allan Poe. Think about it for a sec. Edogawa Rampo is perhaps Japan's first thoroughly Western author, and by that I mean he was almost exclusively influenced by Western novels and short stories, and he really only sought to produce thoroughly Western short stories in return. He was really not interested at all in any sort of traditional Japanese storytelling. Both Izumi Kyoka and Edogawa Rampo have been translated into English, though some of the translations are better than others. So if you're interested in looking at the evolution of Japanese horror, or you just want to read some really old novels, then I suggest you check them out. Some of Edogawa Rampo's more well-known stories, like The Human Chair and Caterpillar, have actually been adapted into a J-horror movie called Rampo Noir, which is actually quite recent. However, the adaptations don't really have very much in common with their literary predecessors. As I mentioned before, the golden age of Japanese cinema was the 1950s and the 1960s. This is when filmmakers like Kurosawa Akira, Kobayashi Masaki, and Mizoguchi Kenji were all making their films. For the horror genre, this is when Nakagawa Nobuo was making his films. He's probably the most influential Japanese horror director from this period, and he is considered the father of the horror genre in Japan. His 1960 film, Jigoku, or Hell, it's just really amazing, and I'll probably talk about that later. Some of his other films that you might have heard of are Mansion of the Ghost Cat, which is 1958, The Lady Vampire, 1959, and The Ghost of Yotsuya, or Yotsuya Kaidan, which is 1959 as well. However, in the 1990s, something big happened, and you all know what it is. This is when Nakata Hideo released a film adaptation of a book by Suzuki Koji called The Ring. This was such a huge, big hit that it really changed the Japanese horror industry forever, and in many ways sort of initiated the renaissance of Japanese filmmaking that we're seeing happening today. The Ring is definitely very innovative, but the reason I believe it was so successful is because in many ways it's actually a return to the roots of the Japanese horror genre. We don't really see modern cinema's obsession with gore and blood and violence. Instead, The Ring is what I would call a mood piece, and it draws much of its effect from the ability of the director to create a very subtly disturbing atmosphere, which is done through a variety of ways: cinematography, music, sound. This is a formula that really holds true for a lot of Japanese horror movies like One Missed Call, Ju-on the Grudge, Pulse. But as you can tell from the movies I just listed, even Nakata Hideo, the director of The Ring, is not the only influential, or even the most influential director in the J-horror genre. If I had to highlight some of the really big directors that you should know when it comes to Japanese horror, I would choose Nakagawa Nobuo, who's the guy I talked about before from the 1960s, Nakata Hideo, who directed The Ring, Kurosawa Kiyoshi, who did Cure and Charisma and a whole bunch of other films that are all very good, and Shimizu Takashi, who did The Grudge. And this list really only includes what I consider like straight up horror directors. It does not include modern Japanese directors that I find a little bit more difficult to classify, like Tsukamoto Shinya, who did A Snake of June and Tetsuo the Iron Man, Sono Shion, Kitamura Ryuhei, and that powerhouse of Japanese cult cinema we all know and love, Miike Takashi. And even though this guy isn't Japanese, he certainly falls into the broader J-horror or disturbing Asian cinema genre. Park Chan-wook, I can't really speak or pronounce Korean, but I think Park Chan-wook is his name. And if you guys haven't seen Old Boy, then you're dead to me. Seriously, go out and see Old Boy. Clearly, this is a really big genre, and I'm not particularly interested in spending oodles of time dissecting all of the films that fall under this genre. So I'll be touching on some of the cornerstones and also talking later about things that I really love and are my favorites. But if you're explicitly interested in Japanese horror, then I really suggest that you go and check out Tokyo Swan's Japanese horror reviews. He's reviewed a lot and really shows no signs of slowing down with his reviews, which is awesome. And more importantly, his reviews are a lot less dense and boring than mine are, so they're probably more fun to watch because he's not throwing all these crazy facts at you. But in any case, now that I've gone over some of the basics, the first horror film that I would like to talk about is Yotsuya Kaidan.